Welcome to Unsheltered Conversations, the podcast from HomeAid America, where we explore the human stories, partnerships, and solutions shaping the conversation around homelessness. I'm Scott Larson, CEO of HomeAid America. Today's conversation is with someone who has spent decades helping the public understand homelessness, not just as a statistic, but a deeply human story. Kevin Fagan is an award-winning journalist who spent many years reporting on homelessness for the San Francisco Chronicle. His reporting has taken him into encampments, shelters, hospitals, and city halls, documenting the realities of life on the streets and the systems meant to respond to it. His book, The Lost and the Found, brings readers into the lives of individuals experiencing homelessness in a way that is extremely honest. It's a little bit raw. It's compassionate and deeply revealing. At HomeAid, we recently featured Kevin's book in our national newsletter and in our recommended reading section on our website because it provides such a powerful lens into the human experience beyond homelessness. Kevin, I want to thank you and welcome you to Unsheltered Conversations. I'm grateful that you're here.
Hey, thanks, Scott. Thanks for having me. I love talking about this and I love what you guys do. So I'm very happy to be here.
Well, I appreciate it. And as someone who's interviewing an award-winning journalist who's usually on the other side of it, a little nervous, not really, but I appreciate you being on the other side of the microphone, on the other side of the questions, because you're going to bring such a rich dialogue to our listeners and really exposing some of the things that you have in your book. And as we begin, you've been with the San Francisco Chronicle for years, but how did you begin your own story, your own journey? Because I know it's very personal. And then how did that spin into covering homeless issues for the San Francisco Chronicle?
They say, cover, what you know, write what's personal. And when I was 16, I got tossed out of my house and I was homeless, essentially, and decided I was going to put myself through college because I'd been raised in an educated household, but was poor, but valued college and books. And, my parents and I patched things up years later. But meanwhile, 16 on my own, I had to figure things out. And that meant living in an unfinished garage for a little while, sleeping in a field, sleeping in my car, working a zillion crummy jobs, doing the kind of things just to propel myself forward. And by the time I got that degree, I had become an editor on one of the campus magazines, which allowed me to chuck the other jobs. And I thought, why someone becomes poor, why someone becomes homeless, this is really fascinating to me because I wanted to figure it out. I wanted to figure out why this happened to me personally and then why this happens to other people. And this was in the 70s, before the wave of homelessness that we now know as homelessness. And I wrote my first homeless story in 1978. It was at a time when I was still sleeping in the car, and it was around San Jose State University is where I went. And San Jose back then, downtown, now it's kind of technified and pretty snappy. But back then it was really kind of a scary place at night. And so I spent all night hanging out in the scene and did a story that ran in the student newspaper. And I thought, I like doing that. That's where I want to be. So.
Well, a couple of quick things. One, I'm grateful that you were able to reconcile with your parents. I mean, that could be a whole story in and of itself, just your journey and being on your own at 16. It's scary enough when you think of an 18-year-old, let alone a 24-year-old being on their own, but you were on your own at 16. But you mentioned, and you talk about this a little bit in your book, but you had a passion for writing. You had a passion for journalism. You had something that drove you and you dove into the issues, but you had to sleep in your car. You were definitely precariously housed, if not housed at all. But your story in and of itself is a story of reconciliation, redemption, and it could have gone a completely different path. And so I'm grateful that you fold that into the story because it definitely sets the stage for what's to come in the book.
Yeah, I realized that I was lucky. My parents they didn't know how to do kids very well. They got divorced. Things blew up, like in a lot of families. But my mom had been a Navy journalist in the Korean War, and my dad was an English teacher. And early on, my mom told me that journalism was the best thing in the world. And so when I was about 14, I got on the little high school newspaper. And that's another epiphany for me. Like in 1978, I thought, wow, this is what I want to do. This is what I love. So that was lucky for me because it gave me a direction and a goal. And a lot of people don't have that. I was also lucky that I didn't get drawn into hard drugs. I didn't do the kind of things that can suck you down and keep you down. And that was, not everyone can be expected to avoid the shoals, so to speak, of life. You're lucky if you come through okay when you have challenges like that.
And kind of spinning off of that, a lot of journalists, and I've read a lot of not only things in the paper, but other books, they'll discuss homelessness from policy and more academics or numbers, which is definitely important. We can't leave that out. But your work consistently focuses on the human side of the story. Do you think that your personal story led into that, or why is that important to you to focus on the human side of the issue?
Because believe me, I love writing about policy, and I have done a lot of that. My writing helped change policy towards supportive housing and street counseling, and I'm very proud of that. But what I have always wanted to do was take you with me by the hand into the street to see what these conditions are. And, I have a friend who came up with this thing. I was talking a while back. He said, we speak two languages, street and English. And in the street, you're not food insecure. No, you're freaking hungry. And you're not housing insecure. You're homeless. You're not, unhoused for the moment or experiencing homelessness. And I respect the impulse to use softer phrases to describe that. But for me, it's always visceral and personal. And when I hang out with chronically homeless people, they don't use the nicer terms. It's a terrible way to have to live. No one wants to be homeless. When I write something, I want you to be there with me and see that this is not how people should live, and we need to do something about it.
And as people read or listen to your book, you're going to see that because it's deeply personal and it's very immersive. You are there on the street with you. I mean, when I read it, I was there with you on the streets of San Francisco, on the waterfront. When you meet Tyson, I was there with you when you met Rita at the homeless island. So how would you describe what your book tells, that part of it? Can you give people a glimpse to those things that they will experience when they're beginning to read the personal and immersive parts of things?
Yeah, sure. The book has a little preamble. This being a book and not a journalism story, my editor said, give a little background first. So I did what they call throat clearing as in my business, or a little bit of how San Francisco has always had drug problems, homeless problems to some extent, dating back to the gold rush in the 1800s. But in 2003, we got a bunch of new editors at the Chronicle, and one of them was Robert Rosenthal, this terrific editor from Philadelphia. And he looked around at the homeless scene and said, what the hell? And said, send some people out to figure it out. So they put me and Brant Ward, a photographer, out on the street. And we spent 6 months sleeping, hanging, talking, all over the city. And one of the main places we wound up at was Homeless Island, which is a triangle of cement just a little south of City Hall, amazingly, just a couple of blocks, where 12 addicts were living, homeless addicts. Some of them turned tricks in the alleys. Some of them dealt dope. All of them panhandled the traffic because it was at a corner of Van Ness and Mission Streets, if people know that area, which has a lot of traffic and stoplights. So when people are stopped, you go panhandle them. You can make good money. And that's where I met Rita and a bunch of other just fascinating people that broke your heart once you got into their stories. Because I always want to, when I do anything immersive, I want to get to the bottom of their stories. How did they start out? Everyone was somebody's baby with hope and a future, and then things go wrong through bad choices, bad fate. So Rita was, she was heartbreaking because you could tell that she had, like a lot of people in the street, she had really had some promise and a life before, a life that wasn't street. And I wrote this series after the 6 months. It was a 5-day series called Shame of the City that kind of had a national splash, so to speak. And one of her friends back east read it, which was nice, and then forwarded it to her family in Florida, who said, wow, okay, that's where she is. They lost track of her. They came out, found her using the story, got her, took her home, and she rehabbed beautifully. I waited a year to go see if it would stick. But it was so inspiring to see how she had, with the help of her family, and she found some faith. She was Christian, got clean, got medicated because she was near death from AIDS and infections and all kinds of stuff. And it was really lovely. We became friends. I wrote about her. Actually, Gavin Newsom, who was mayor at the time, started a program called Homeward Bound back then. And I love that program because it reunites people with their families. And about half of them stay, which is a really phenomenal percentage for chronically homeless folks. Then another half or so go back to the street, but then you try again. That's how I got to know Rita.
As someone, when they read the book, you're going to learn that you spent time getting to know Rita's family and Rita's story. And you talk about how things led to where she's at. And it's phenomenally beautiful and heartbreaking as well. And you just mentioned with Governor Newsom, who was then mayor at the time, and the connecting people from there on the streets to their families. And in your book, you also talk about Kevin Adler and his organization, which we've gotten to know him as well. And that is such an important piece of reconnecting, if possible, with where those roots are, because the people on the streets, they've lost that whole social network. I mean, they have those other addicts around them. They have that, in a sense, new family, but it's not going to get them where they need to go. And you saw that. You saw that it needed something other than those 19 people living on the island with them, which they were surviving together. And you learn about what they were doing to support each other. And when someone died or they had hope for people, I mean, it was very, very real when you're reading those stories.
Yeah. And the communities that get created in the street when you're lucky enough to be in a camp like that persists, those communities are very important. They're not idyllic little communes. Bad things can happen there too, but at least there's a sense of commonality. I mean, it's a rough way to live, but the homeless island was a good group.
Well, the other person that we get to know in your book is Tyson, and you met him down on the waterfront. What's interesting, again, just the connections. You were discussing what spawned that story was the Navigation Center, which that concept was new. So tell us a little bit about Tyson and how you met Tyson and how he's woven into your book.
Yeah, I thought navigation centers they were conceived. Bevan Dufty was the homeless director for the city. I think it was 2015. I can't remember the exact date, but he came up with this idea that, of nav centers, which and now has spread everywhere. And there've been a form of that everywhere, just with different names. So there was a proposal to put one on the waterfront near the famous ferry building, a few blocks south of that. So I go raunching around talking to folks because I never wanted to do just a policy story with guys in City Hall scratching their chins about where to spend money. You want to go talk to the people being affected, the residents and the non-residents, the folks living in the street. And I ran into Tyson sitting on a piece of cardboard in the sun. He'd just smoked up some meth and his head was clear. That's the thing. You want to have a conversation with someone when they're not dope sick and kind of jittery and, rocking back and forth. He was in good shape. We had a great conversation. He was a thoughtful guy. I thought, well, this guy has some education and, his head is straight. So quoted him, put a picture in the paper, and his brother in Ohio named Barron read this and calls me up, says, I haven't seen him in 7 years. I want to fly out there. I'm hiring an interventionist. I'm doing a GoFundMe for rehab. I'm going to give him a chance to get off the street and help me find him. So he flew out here, and I'd been asked that quite a bit. I mean, Kevin Adler and I kind of connected on the whole finding people thing years and years ago when he first started doing some of his work. And I didn't always write stories about it. I didn't know if I was going to write something about Tyson because I thought, well, as a journalist, you have to be a human first, reporter second.
Yep. You have to pick and choose. Correct.
Yeah. And I thought, okay, I'll help this guy out. Well, after talking to him and thinking about it and looking at stuff, I thought I'll take a notebook. And then the day came and I said, all right, let's get a photographer. Maybe something will come out of this. We can do a scene on the waterfront. But it turned into something more joyful than that because we found Tyson and Barron had rented a hotel room. We went back to the hotel room and he and Vicky, the interventionist, led the intervention. But I participated. I'm not going to just sit there and take notes. My role was to say, Tyson, this is, take this chance. You don't want to live in the street, right? No, he didn't. Take this shot. You can live. And he did. And it was just wonderful. It was like with Rita, seeing someone rise from the street is just the most inspiring thing because I don't know how many probably dozens of obituaries and obituaries that I didn't write about people that I knew who died in the street. It's far more common and just soul crushing to see people die like that. But these two made it off the street and it was wonderful.
So you touched on a very important point that every day in thousands of people in communities and hundreds of thousands across the country die in the streets every year. And the majority of them die without that connection back to family. And that is gut wrenching. It's not how us as people, us as humanity need to be approaching this issue. And even if one looks at it as, that person made these choices, et cetera, we have to go back to the humanity. And so what do you feel are the assumptions that people make? And, there's so many assumptions about homeless issues. Is it personal choice? Is it addiction? Is it mental illness? Is all of that in your reporting paints a very, very complex picture of it. But what are some of the biggest misconceptions you think the public has about homelessness? And what would you like them to hear at this point?
Generalizing is the worst of it. And then over the years, there have been national and regional leaders who promulgate this idea that homeless people are just lazy and they want to be homeless out in the world. And sometimes you can always find an interview with someone who's usually some 25-year-old kid trying to be a bohemian for a moment, saying, yeah, I love the outdoor.
Yeah, they're living on the beach. They're the coastal homeless or the surfer homeless.
Right. I want to be free.
Correct.
Sure. They want to be free until it gets old. And I'll tell you, man, after college, I was a street singer around the world in Europe and Australia and places like that. And sleeping in fields, which was a continuation of my homeless experience. But I knew that was voluntary because I liked it. I'd roll into town, play a gig in the street, get booked at a club or a cafe, stay for a while, meet other, it was a way to get around. And so kids like doing some version of that. And so some people will quote them saying, I love the free life. And so then people assume, oh, well, all homeless people really like being free and outdoors. No, not at all. Because usually the older homeless people come up to the younger ones, and it cracks me up when you see this say, do you want to be me?
Yeah.
No, get off the street. So there's an assumption that people choose it and they don't. It's bad fate and bad luck. Things happen. You get domestic violence, beaten up by your partner, abused, thrown out by your family. A huge number of kids who are homeless are LGBTQ. They've been thrown out by their family, ostracized by their communities. There's always that core in those people that you meet on the street that wants to be housed again, wants to be back to some kind of stable life. The other misconception, I think, is that the chronically homeless people that you see shooting up, sleeping in tents, sprawled on the sidewalk, doing that stuff, that's only about 30% of the population. The rest of the homeless folks are in shelters or couch surfing or temporary institutions of some kind, jail for the moment, and they have a greater chance of cycling back into stability. The chronic people, a lot of people think, oh, well, that's what all homeless folks look like. Well, it's not, but they're the most in need. And they need us. They need our society. And we fail them as a whole. For every one person taken off the street in San Francisco, 4 more take their place. How is that okay?
And that is not just even in San Francisco. That's in LA, San Diego, all across the country, not even just here on the West Coast. And it's very clear as your work, your articles, and also the book, how fragile stability can be. They're right there and they fall back. And that whole aspect of that whole series of events that happen, the job loss, the medical bills, housing costs, and you've touched on it numerous times already, family breakdown. Something happens to you personally, and I can reflect back on decisions that I was making as a young adult that could have pivoted me in a different direction. And so that is so important for people to understand when they're seeing someone on the street or living in their car or even at the convenience store or wherever they might see someone that they either suspect or literally know are on the streets. Put yourself in their shoes and try to understand it, because that could have been you. So do you think that as you worked on your reporting and you think about how people fall into the homelessness, did that change at anywhere along the way? I mean, because you were experiencing it at some point, but was there other epiphanies that you saw about how people fall into homelessness or that they can recover and get out?
Not a whole lot of mysteries. No, your family explodes, you get beat up, you fail out of whatever job or education thing you're trying, you get depressed. Mental illness. I mean, mental illness is a factor. About a third of the homeless have mental illness issues. And certainly if you've been chronically homeless for a year or more, you're pretty clear. Yeah.
You're going to get it. Yeah.
Yeah. You got trauma and you're probably doing some kind of drugs because it's so miserable and drugs are really available.
Well, even for yourself at that, you spend some nights on the street,
Yeah.
stayed with them, but you spend more than a few, you're going to begin to have your circadian rhythms get off. You're going to look to how am I going to self-medicate? And all of a sudden you are at a very different spot, but you had an out and these people do not.
Yeah. Yeah. It's finding the out and taking the out and sticking with the out.
Yeah. I think that's one of the things that, again, your book with both Rita and Tyson's story, the restoration of dignity and their own identity for themselves, that they had to see that and they had to come to that realization. We meet their families. We saw what their dreams were and what they could be. And why was that important to you to bring that aspect into both Rita's and Tyson's story, that aspect of dignity and the refining themselves, their own identity?
Because you need to have that to sustain your stability. There's nothing more inspiring than talking to folks like Rita and Tyson who, once they've gotten themselves straight, clean, moving forward, roof on the head, door to close, they say, I don't know how I lived like that in the street. It's what was going on. And that's a wonderful place to see someone arrive at. And I want people in the book, I want reading the book to understand that there is redemption. There's rejuvenation, and it's totally possible and it's beautiful, but it's necessary because just putting someone inside and saying, okay, here's a roof. Now fix yourself. No, you need help.
It's not going to happen. Yeah.
Yeah. And if you give the help and someone gets their life in order again, then they can be self-sustaining. And that's a wonderful thing because once you get someone into supportive housing with case management and guidance at its best, after a period of time, it can take years, it can take months, whatever it takes, you can stabilize yourself enough to move out and begin a new stage in your life. For some people, that's the first stage they've had that was truly stable and moving forward. Some people, you got to give people hope and chance.
Well, and when you think about it, the day-to-day events that led to months, that led to years, that got somebody on the street, it's going to take those types of things to get back that length of time. And it's not just like flipping a switch. It could, but you have to realize that as many issues and things that cause them to be there are going to be things that have to be unpacked moving forward. So you've covered a lot in your career as a reporter, a journalist for the Chronicle, from natural disasters to issues we're talking about issues on the streets to tragic things. What has stayed with you the most, and how does this issue of homelessness fit into all the things that you've written about over your career?
Well, I started out right after college when I started getting into newspapers as a crime reporter. So it became a specialty. And because of the way I like to do homelessness, I did that in crime too. I like to be there on the scene. I've seen people bleed out, been shot at, been cut, watched people die in front of me, burned to death. I wanted to do the intensive kind of stories. That takes its toll on your head. And as the decades went by, I realized, yeah, it's interesting and it's horrible and it's worth reporting about, but you don't really learn much from covering murder and disaster. I watched executions in San Quentin prison more than other folks. There wasn't much to learn except horror and sorrow. But with homelessness, when you cover homelessness, if you really get into the nuts and bolts and show cause and effect, you can make a difference.
Yes.
Covering a mass shooting, not making much of a difference, as horrible as it is. But cover something like Homeless Island, and you can show that street outreach and supportive housing, that makes a difference. So I loved that. That was my takeaway from my fairly long career.
It's good to hear that aspect, because what we do at HomeAid, our mission is ultimately to build housing or programmatic facilities or things that allow each, we talk about the continuum of care. You need all of these different avenues for someone to find that opportunity to have redemption or their life become different. And we're doing that through the built environment. And from your perspective, decades of reporting, how important is housing or these facilities to part of the solution?
It's huge. There are a lot of voices in the country that say that homelessness is a housing problem, and it is. It's also a national health problem, and it's also we don't have a living wage. I mean, you should be able to push a broom as a janitor like I did and have a decent life and have your dignity. It can be crushing. The effects of running in place and not getting ahead and falling backwards while you're full-time working. I think that is as damaging as a lot of things. Not having access to good health, those housing, health, and living wage to be able to work with dignity. I think those things, if we could address those fully as a country, we could really end homelessness.
And that's what we take a look at. We're pulling in builders who are building housing for their living and trying to tap into kind of what they've been trained to do. And that deeper layer is you're building these new communities, you're building phenomenal places for people to live. Let's bring it to another level and bring you into housing and for those that literally are needing it today. So when you're looking at, there's the role that we're playing. Obviously, you have politicians, you have other community leaders that, whether or not by design in their political platform or by default, they've got a family member that they're passionate about solving this issue. But what can the average person do when they're looking at this issue? What can that person do from your perspective as they read your book or read an article? What should their takeaway be? What can they do?
It's tough because, I mean, there are personal local things you can do, which I find very useful. And then there are the activism things you can do. You can advocate for politicians who push for the things you want. I would advocate for politicians who want to create a minimum wage that works for people, that supports affordable housing issues and efforts like yours, and that supports expanding healthcare. I mean, cutting healthcare, which has happened in the last year or two, is going the wrong way.
Yes.
It's going backwards. So that's one way to do it as a an overall societal thing. Personally, when you walk, well, like Kevin Adler says, when you walk by, I think is the name of his book.
That's the name of his book, When You Walk By.
That's right. When you walk by homeless folks, most people feel either revulsion, sorrow, or indifference.
Or fear. Yeah.
Or fear.
Yeah.
And if a homeless person isn't, rocking in place, jabbering to themselves or angrily punching the air or, having an episode of some kind, stop and spend a minute to talk. Give them the dignity of being seen. We're all ripples on the water and on the rock. Every moment of kindness that you spend with people helps them remember that there is a better life and contributes to moving forward eventually. So just stop and say hello. Most homeless folks are going to say, give me $1. A lot of times it's going to go for booze or dope because food in most cities, you can generally find soup kitchens, friendly people, dumpsters. I mean, when I was food insecure, there's ways to find food. And that isn't to say that hunger is not an issue. But for homeless folks, your time and buy them a meal. I do a thing which most doctors probably wouldn't like too much, but I carry cigarettes. I've never met a chronically homeless person. Actually, I did once, who doesn't want a cigarette. So they say, give me $1. Give me $5. I mean, it's amazing. And I say, as a reporter, we're not supposed to give money. So I'm not going to give you money, but I'll give you a cigarette. They light up. Pretty soon you're chatting. A lot of times I would even light one with them, which I hope doesn't come back to bite me later. It's have a conversation and really listen, because they can tell if you're not interested, but really listen. They're good conversations. Most homeless folks are funny. They good jokes, good stories.
Well,
a lot
I bet.
more interesting. Yeah. I'd rather talk to a homeless guy than most mayors and presidents and governors and
That Wall Street financier. It's like,
yeah.
yeah. So certainly, this work is very heavy, and you've seen it, and your writing reflects tragedy and resilience, and also hope. But what gives you hope when you think about how we're going to address this?
It's hard to keep hope in the current climate. I don't want to get political because, I'm still, as a reporter, I try to remain kind of nonpartisan. There are a lot of good people in this country and a lot of good people with a lot of good ideas from the top levels of government right on down to the street. At its core, America has some great founding principles of, equality for all, equal opportunity, pursuit of happiness, all the stuff that we know so well. I believe that is in the DNA of the country. And I think we can get there. We're not there, but I like to be around people who give me hope. I mean, I have a daughter who's just like a shining light in my life, and she and her young friends make me think, okay, we're in pretty good shape for the future.
And likewise with my daughters.
Yeah.
So as your book comes to a close, because there's triumph and tragedy in your book, but when they get to the very last chapter or so that you talk about the future and talk about the takeaways, can you just give a glimpse of that as you close your book on what do you do with it? What do you do with this after you read your book? You close the book in very, very important ways. Can you shed a little bit of light on that?
Thank you. Go help your fellow human being. Helping find people, that's kind of tough. The stuff that Kevin does, Adler, and the stuff that I've done, you have to guard yourself, for your own safety. If you're not really comfortable walking around in dark alleys or cold calling people, that may not be the thing for you, but you can help people take someone to a shelter if they're in distress. I do this around the Bay Area when I'm driving. If someone wants to go to a drop-in center, wants to go to a shelter, and I can judge pretty well whether someone's going to be safe or not, because I've had, I've been attacked. Not that often. Most homeless folks are not going to attack you. It's other folks that are preying on the homeless people that are going to attack you. But be a helpful, empathetic human being in the world. And like I said, support causes and civic leaders that are heading the way you want things to head, toward kindness and help and construction of things we need, like affordable housing and better healthcare, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, because it all comes down to for the limited or the lengthy time that we're here on this planet, that we're humans. And we have to view all of our neighbors and people around us in that regard. And so you end with a call for humanity, to be human and to be caring and kind. And I really appreciated how you closed the book.
Thanks. We all have different ways we do that. I mean, I'm a singer-songwriter in the other half of my, part of my life. And so I sing usually when I give speeches. I did a lot of appearances for the book, and I usually try to end with one or two homeless songs. One is called Homeless Brother. The catchphrase is, that homeless brother is my friend. I want to communicate empathy. And I go play, and I've played in board and care homes, homeless settings, to help just people feel kinder, feel better. Other people can do it in other ways. You do it in your writing, your, activism, working at a lot of kids work in soup kitchens and help do that. And that can be enormously rewarding because people are happy when they get fed. It's a lovely thing.
Yep. It's all about this being our journey and our human story. And the better we understand not only our own story, like yours and mine, but the stories of those that are around us, the better we can be equipped to build real solutions, whether or not it's one person at a time, like you did with both Tyson and Rita, or systems as we look at things from a national perspective and issues around the world.
Which, since I'm a reporter, once a reporter, always, why in the world do you do what you do? I mean, what led you to want to work in affordable housing?
It's an interesting aspect, because when I first took my job at HomeAid, I had both construction and nonprofit background, and someone told me about the position, and I thought, well, it's going to get me out of the position that I was in, because I was I was looking to leave another former employment, and I thought, I'll give it a couple of years. Well, that's 25, close to 30 years later, and the thing that I have found is that, one, I love the building industry and I love building things in the built environment. But what we do with that added purpose and the human element has caused so much change in my personal life. But the thing that I've seen is that as we build a project, the people that live in that project, I don't I probably will never see, maybe one or two at a dedication.
Yeah.
But it's the people in the building industry that I see their lives change as well. And that's been such a motivating work. The architects that HomeAid gets to work with, the builders, the trades, the suppliers. And that is so rejuvenating. I tell this story very often because it's so deeply touching for me. As I was walking up to one of our projects that was a domestic violence shelter, there was a person finishing the sidewalk out front of it. And I walked up, I get out of my car, and I'm not that construction guy, but I walk up to that construction guy and I said, "Do you know what you're doing?" And he looked at me like, "You're an idiot. Of course I know what I'm doing." It's like, no. That's not, do you know what this project is all about? So I went on to tell him about, this is a domestic violence shelter and he paused and he looked at me and he said, "I get to go home tonight and tell my wife that I did something of value today."
Yeah.
That is why I do what I do. Because that guy, who knows what his life was like with his wife. And obviously he was a skilled craftsman at his work,
Yeah.
but he saw that deeper value of that sidewalk that was going to bring people into a place of refuge and a place of security and a place of a future. That's why I do what I do.
That's good. I think most people want to be decent. I mean, you look at the toxic internet, and social media space, but you take even people who can be mean, you put them face to face with someone and the lights will go off. Mostly. I think most people want to be decent. That's a beautiful thing. The guy goes home and he feels like he did it. We should all feel like that.
We all should feel that way.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
Well, Kevin, this has been a great conversation today. I've really appreciated it. If people that are listening want to learn more about Kevin's work, I highly encourage you to read The Lost and the Found. It's such an extraordinary work, and it brings both clarity and compassion to a conversation that our country, communities, and individuals urgently need. You can read more about it on our website, but I deeply appreciate it. Kevin, any parting words before we close you want to give to our listeners?
Just thank you very much for hearing what I was trying to say in the book. I really appreciate that. And I love it when people want to read the book and they hear, can't make anyone read a book, but
no.
I like it when people get the message that I'm trying to get across. And I really appreciate you having me on this show and helping spread that message. Thank you.
Well, absolutely. Because it's one of the most profound works that I've read, and I hope that others will as well. Well, for our listeners, thank you for listening to Unsheltered Conversations. I'm Scott Larson. And until next time, let's keep building homes, communities, and pathways to hope.